Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you. Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are doing a recap of the episode we had with Travis Cottrell, and we have invited Michelle Goodman to join us for this recap. So I'm going to let Michelle speak to these experiences, but I just wanted to kind of give a brief intro that we've invited Michelle on today because we feel like she has various and dynamic experiences that really speak to this conversation. She has worked in positions of vision casting. She has had experience in fundraising both personally and with an organization. And she, in general, has worked in influencing people. And for those reasons and many more, we have asked her to unpack this conversation with us. Michelle, would you mind chiming in and giving us some insight into what you do now?
Yeah. First of all, thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Feels like, woohoo! Feels like a gift to me. Currently, I work for a local church. I'm based in Fort Collins, Colorado. And my role is to oversee all of our volunteer teams. And so kind of what that looks like, part of the role is welcoming those that are new to the church or new to the faith, and then helping people to really tap into the way that God has made them to be able to serve and build up the church inside the church. And then, of course, moving outside into different spheres of influence.
Yeah. And it feels like this conversation with Travis is so applicable to what you're doing because, you know, as you're overseeing people that are themselves kind of going out to welcome and to kind of guide people towards areas of service or prayer or whatever, it just feels really important to keep the values of authenticity or vulnerability. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but just really, really meaningful connections.
Yeah, I do have a question about that. But before I get into that question, I'm wondering if you can tell people like what personal/professional experience have you had in the fundraising arena?
Yes. Fundraising. The first time I started fundraising or support raising was when I was 20, and I was going out on a mission trip to West Africa and wasn't really connected to a local church and wasn't really connected to an organization. But I was going and I knew I needed to raise money. And so I feel like that whole experience, I was raising like maybe $3,000. It was just for 2 weeks over Christmas break, my senior year of college. But I felt like I did a ton of things then that I would do super differently now, knowing what I know. But I feel like what it did was really cultivated this heart in me to be dependent on the Lord. And that, to me, like what was formed in me in that season of, okay, I am like a child that is dependent on my Father for everything, for food, for every dollar, for a plane ticket, for all of the things and all of the care that I needed. I feel like what happened in me during those months is a posture that I've consistently carried with me. And so there are times where I can feel like my hands closing or my grip getting tight on something. And then it feels like I'll become aware of that and be able to open my hands again. And so whether it's been like in my personal support raising onto an overseas trip or onto domestic missions, whether it's that or it's like, okay, this is the posture that I'm leaning into a situation with of open hands, feel like it's kind of one and the same of dependence on the Lord, engaging conversation with people and having a posture that's willing to receive. I think that's a key that maybe we can come back to. But the other side of this coin would be the last position that I worked in was for a beautiful mobilization organization where I really worked on the front end of engaging with people that were exploring life overseas. And so people would consider, what would it look like for me to move overseas into the nations? And so oftentimes one of the first kind of key barriers or hesitations that would come up for people was the idea of support raising.
Yep.
And so I think through that, the main places of encouragement that I could offer those people would be kind of looking at the support raising or fundraising as a spiritual formation process, being that it is one where perhaps we've like picked up specific views of money based on our family of origin, and how is the Lord's view of it different? And so how can some of that be reframed? And so, yeah, kind of encouraging people to consider support raising as a spiritual formation process to uncover what's in their heart and then have courage to lean into it.
Well, Heather and I would agree with that.
Yeah, actually, we did not plan this, but that's like pretty much exactly the premise of our podcast.
We did not pay her to say this.
No, we did not. But fundraising,
true,
like as
you could,
yeah, fundraising as formation. And I heard you say you were formed into dependence, and how that plays out and comes to bear on very unrelated circumstances, even right now. Not even related to fundraising, but still like opening your hands and trusting yourself to the Lord, depending on Him. And that's, listener, that is exactly what our hope for you is in engaging this week over week, is just that this is forming you into greater dependence on the Father and more Christ-likeness.
I'm curious, Michelle, as well, like what are some threads that you were able to pull out? And maybe this is how we start the conversation, but some threads that you were able to pull out from what Travis said and maybe even apply them directly to what you're doing now and to who you're working with.
Yeah, I loved the conversation with Travis. I think one of the major key points that stood out to me was when he talked about preparedness not equaling performance.
Yeah. That's
and
great.
I think that's so true. And it's true in the local church context, and it feels true in like a difficult conversation with a family member.
Oh, yeah.
It feels just like real across the board. But I think we can assume that preparing for something, even like preparing for this podcast, listening to what did Travis say, what are some of the key points, preparing for it does not equal inauthenticity,
right,
as you guys shared on that podcast. But yeah, that's one of the things that stood out to me.
Yeah, which feels like a really important distinction, especially as we look at, the upcoming generation that really values authenticity, and just highlighting that preparedness can kind of be the trellis for authenticity to move on, right?
And you've worked with so speaking of this generation, I mean, Michelle, you've worked with Gen Z a lot, and maybe you can confirm or
reframe.
Reframe this a little bit. But it does seem like this generation in particular, Generation Z, has a high value on authenticity and kind of grassroots and kind of a mistrust, for lack of a better term, of like big corporate movements and maybe even like big church that is a little bit too shiny.
Yeah, totally. I would agree with that and what I learned in working with Gen Z. So I think the question is, like, for me to stand in front of Gen Z and invite them into something that would pretty much dismantle their life. An invitation to move, an invitation to support raise, an invitation to maybe let go of the dream that you had for your life. For me to do that, I have to show up while being authentic. And so I thought that Travis and really both of you guys painted this so beautifully of doing the research and having the like data points of information, but also carrying like, what is my personal why in all of this? And so in every presentation that I would give, I would like go back to my why of why do I believe this and why is this important to me? And then really speak out of that place, not only that place, but to kind of have that as the anchoring point and then be able to add in, okay, these other details and points that have kind of propelled me in this belief or me in this advocacy for a specific people group. That's been.
And to be clear, Travis is not Generation Z.
No.
But he has some characteristics like that seems to resonate, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciated it, kind of to what you just said, Michelle. I think it was towards the end of our conversation with him when we asked him, hey, what else would you want to say by way of encouragement? And he said to remember their first love of Jesus and what were the markers that got you to where you are now that made you say yes and speak out of that passion. And I thought that was so good. Yeah, it's going back to the why.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's wonderful to value authenticity. I mean, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't, like you were saying, it doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice preparedness and professionalism to a certain degree as well.
Yeah. And I feel like people can know when something is going from like preparedness to pretense. I feel like you can kind of start seeing in your heart and thoughts that you're moving out of just being well prepared to a place of performing or pretense or
robotic
or trying to like force something. Yeah. Because it's generally accompanied by anxiety or, you know, as Travis was saying, you stop thinking about the people. Maybe you're thinking more about yourself and a little more focused on what you're saying and how you feel about that and how you're being perceived and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved the point that he made of with his choir, having the choir, like their first position is intercession, meaning prayer. And so as they're singing, they're looking out of the faces of the people and praying for them. And that too feels like that helps us, I think, to get our eyes off of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Which helps us to be authentic because we're like looking at the person across from us and meeting them where they are and offering some of the things that are in our heart to them or leading them into spaces that were a space like worship.
Yeah, great point.
Mm-hmm. So the pull quote that we have at the beginning of his episode, I just loved it. He said, there's always more room for sensitivity to the Spirit. There's always more room for generosity, and there's always more room for authenticity. We've spoken, you know, to authenticity, but just the values of generosity and openness to the Spirit and responsiveness to the Spirit. I just thought that was so good. Because really, that's where the power comes, right? I mean, you can be prepared, you can be authentic, but honestly, it's the power and movement and conviction and wooing of the Holy Spirit that only ever moves people to, I think, ultimately belief or partnership, right? It's like there's just always an element that we are not enough, and that's a good thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want them to be persuaded by the slickness of our presentation. We don't want them to be propelled by how well prepared we are. We want them to be compelled by what the Spirit is doing inside of them.
Yeah.
We don't want to twist any arms.
It's like, it's like you could probably, if you were to twist arms and have the most persuasive presentation ever, no matter what it is, if it's like leading someone to faith or inviting someone to buy the vacuum cleaner or inviting someone to move their life overseas, all of that like will have an end. But when you like show up as a vehicle for the Lord to work through and to minister through to the people, that stuff is eternal. That's the stuff that people are going to be marked by and it's going to propel change. And so, I think showing up prepared and being available. I heard a speaker several years ago. I was studying abroad when I was in college in Australia and was attending a church there. And I heard the pastor say, don't live your life point A to point B. He said, live your life point A to point C and let God be the B. And that has just like stuck with me, whether I'm like driving to work in the morning and knowing, okay, I'm leaving my house and I'm going to work. Well, where am I available to be interrupted? And I think it's the same thing with, the different things that we're talking about of living in the posture of I'm prepared. I know the route that I'm going, but I'm interruptible. And that's what we saw Jesus do time and time again.
Right. A lot of the stories, some of the favorites are him being interrupted. Yeah.
Well, and it's amazing how, you know, acknowledging and even blessing that interruption does so much to just give you the capacity for it and to let you move with it instead of feeling disrupted by it. I recently had another conversation that was just talking about you're going to come up on obstacles in your fundraising, and how much does it help you in kind of moving through those obstacles if you know they're going to come up, versus feeling like, oh, I hit an obstacle. This must mean I shouldn't be doing this, or I'm doing it wrong. And just how freely you can move, or not freely, but maybe how much less burdensome it is to move through that, to expect it and to bless it and to know that God's with you there. So I really love the go from A to C, expecting B to show up. Yeah.
And just to be really practical, when you get down to like brass tacks with actually like planning out how you're going to fundraise and talk to people and onboard, have those conversations, it's great to have a plan. Okay, I'm going to send a letter, and then I'm going to call, and then I'm going to follow up, and then I'm going to do this, 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 and this.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have to be open to that plan getting completely wrecked in every given day or any given week, and just be open to whatever God puts in front of you. Mm-hmm. Like I tell my clients, the people that I'm coaching, over and over and over, like, if somebody crosses paths with you and says, hey, I heard that you're going to Mongolia or wherever, let's go talk about it. Don't say, well, I'd like to tell you about it, but first I gotta get you my letter, and then I'll call you. Like, I think you have to be nimble enough to just be interrupted and see that that's the way the Holy Spirit works sometimes.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, because I think about sitting in fundraising conversations, and you could think you're showing up to ask this person to, maybe it's give $50 a month, or maybe it's to give $20,000 a month, whatever it is. But you can show up prepared with that ask in mind, and then sit with them and see something in them that they actually have a stirring in them, are asking questions around, really, what are the people like? What is life going to look like? And you can kind of hear it and then ask, have you ever thought about going? And so you can think you're showing up with support raising in mind, but really it's a conversation about this person. Something is like happening in their heart where the Lord is inviting them to go. And so
come visit me.
I think
come see what it's like. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that is great. One of the phrases that Travis used that really stuck with me is that our feet aren't in concrete, right? There's a couple of decisions we make where they are, and then there's a lot that they're not. I actually really loved that.
Yes. I loved the picture he said of, like, your feet aren't in concrete. And what instantly came into my mind was the passage of scripture from 1 Corinthians where it talks about being steadfast and immovable. And I think often when I'm praying, I want to be immovable, I actually will picture concrete being poured on my feet. And so him saying that felt like disruptive to me. And then I was thinking about it and kind of realizing the immovable part of this passage is immovable in the Lord. That's the thing that's steady. That's the thing that's anchoring. But it's easy to think my job is anchoring me. This town is anchoring me. And having the open-handedness to be movable.
Right. That's great. What I was really impressed with too early on was as he was talking about his trip to Haiti with Compassion International, and like how he was able to overcome the barriers that he felt within his own heart to asking for funds by actually getting his feet on the ground. And I was just thinking, man, what a fantastic model. Like, what if we could get all of our donors to visit us? Let's get all of our donors to go on a vision trip. Let's like get our church to come and do this. You know, logistically that's challenging, but there is a lot of strength to, and a lot of influence to, like, seeing with their own eyes.
Yeah. Well, and I even think of how impactful that would be, because I know a lot of people that are raising personal support haven't yet started in the ministry that they're going to be part of. And I think that I imagine, I know from my own experience that once I was kind of like feet on the ground working with the people that my heart yearned to work with and minister to, it was very different casting vision for that than before.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So there's definitely tension there. And I would encourage listeners, if they are in an initial fundraising season where they're not yet in that ministry work that they're moving towards, that I think there's so many resources out there to gain insight into different cultures and into other people's stories and experiences and things like that, that I would encourage you to push into that so that you feel like you can speak from a place of understanding that you don't yet have.
And I think, down the road, it's going to become more naturally. So in a large part, kind of like your first foray into fundraising before you leave can be the most challenging because you don't have those experiences. And so I think it speaks to the need to really not cast vision in kind of like a perfunctory kind of general way, but to like get into some of the weeds and like, what is this country that I'm going to? What is some of their context and their history? What are the obstacles that are preventing them from the gospel? How can I cast vision for that broadly? And I think you're going to have more tools the longer you do it. But it is challenging, I think, your first time.
But even in that, coming more from the place of why. Because, in your initial fundraising, you hopefully have a really clear sense of why. Why am I doing this? And so I guess maybe even to go back on what I just said, even if you don't have a lot of context from the actual, what the ministry will look like, don't bypass the very strong experience you do have of your own calling and your own why.
Yeah, I think there's something of once we know something, we can't unknow it, which I think we have a degree of responsibility in, meaning like the first time I learned that 3.4 billion people alive on earth don't have access to the gospel, I can't live without knowing that. It's always something that I carry and that has, that I think is super unfair and unjust. And so what do I do about that? And that kind of propels conversation. But I think for those that are, like you said, support raising, but haven't yet gone, to be able to pinpoint what are the things that leapt in my own heart, or what are the things that I feel angry about and I feel is an injustice, or what are the things that I love about this place? What are some of those facts that I can offer? What do you now know that you want and can tell others about?
Yeah.
Really inviting them into the journey, not just to support you and your story, but I think when somebody gives, they're entering into the story.
Yeah.
And they're a part of it.
Yeah.
It reminds me almost verbatim of something that Travis said. When we find something that's worth it, like we're willing to talk about it. And I think that addresses maybe one of the quasi-common obstacles that people kind of have a stunted vision of why they're doing it. Maybe they haven't really
or an
pondered
unfolding vision, maybe.
Yeah, that's a better word. Yeah, it's a blossoming vision, and it's just early on in the stage,
which makes sense.
It totally does.
Yeah.
And the Lord uses those.
Totally.
Uses that.
Totally.
Yeah, perpetually. Yep. Yeah.
Actually, so, in conversation before this, we learned that you are part of a core team for somebody that's currently fundraising to be sent. I'm curious, just kind of with what we were just talking about in view of entering into the journey, what made you want to be part of a core team, and how do you see value in that?
Let me just say, being part of the core team is one of the greatest joys of my life. It has been so special. One, because I love the person that I'm on the core team for and feel like a huge champion and advocate for. But the part of my heart that comes alive when I get to hear stories of what is she reading about and learning about of the people group that she's going to be interacting with, and bringing prayer points to us. Like one of the things, she's going to be moving to a predominantly Muslim nation. And so during Ramadan, she shared with us a prayer guide. And every day I got an email and signed up for a 15-minute slot every day to pray for the specific Muslims in this nation all throughout Ramadan.
Wow.
And so it's like through prayer, one, I was reading it, and so hearing some stories about the people there, what are the barriers, but also was praying for her in that, knowing, okay, she's gonna, a year from now, her feet are gonna be on the ground there, and she's gonna be in this atmosphere and be there to, like, in relationship and friendship with the unnamed people that I'm praying for right now. So that's been really sweet for my own heart, I think, and just putting wind in my sails of consistently learning more about the people. And I think it's really humbling to watch someone prepare to go overseas. I think there's so many, and if you're preparing to go overseas as you're listening to this, you know these spaces like the back of the back of your hand, you feel them and you live into them. But like the emotions of what does it mean? How many more times do I go home before I move overseas?
Yeah.
Or I've ran out of people to ask for support raising. So now I'm going to ask my core team to ask their people.
Yeah.
Those type of things. But I think on the side of being on a core team, it feels like the greatest honor to be partnered in prayer. And it feels like partnership, yes, with that person, but also with the Lord, and with my whole community in a totally different state than she lives in, but being able to even bring my community into that in different ways.
Yeah.
Very cool.
It's good to hear that from the perspective of a core team member, because I think a lot of times when people are on the front end or they're thinking through, who should I ask? I don't want to be a burden. I don't think it feels like a burden to you, right, Michelle?
Not
I'm not
at
getting
all.
that.
It feels like I could almost burst into tears, happy tears, and sad that she's going, and happy she's going.
Yeah.
Like all of the things come up in me, and I would say that's speaking for the whole core team. I mean, even what's happened between I haven't met any of her core team face to face besides her, but now I know her sister and pastors at her church and her family friends and her close friends from years ago. And so having that community, it's like a space that I look forward to where we encourage one another too, though our primary focus is, of course, the one that's preparing to go.
But community, so community forms when you're on mission together.
Yeah. Very cool.
It's awesome.
Kind of like, I don't know, in contrast to that, because you're talking about a community like rich words of encouragement, advocating for her. Something that really struck me in when Travis said was kind of around maybe people that either bring constructive criticism in a helpful, encouraging way, or kind of hearkening back to some conversations we had earlier this season with the Nichols around feedback that you get that's not as kind, not as helpful. I really loved that Travis talked about receiving what people say, even if only to let the Lord humble you. Even if there's nothing true in what they say, just like receiving it as an opportunity to just be humbled by the Lord. I thought that was itself so humble.
Yeah, just a chance to kind of pause, self-reflect and evaluate. Is there truth here? And I think there's even, that you're right. There's value in just doing that.
Yeah. If only ever to humble us, it has value.
Yeah.
And it has good.
It's hard to be humiliated.
Well, we're not talking about humiliation.
Okay, but they're cousins.
Okay, fair.
But sometimes God can use that too.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, I think that I try and think okay, Lord, what would you have me to do with what I heard?
Good. Yeah.
With feedback. And if the feedback feels to me like I've never heard anything like that before, no one's ever said blank or blank to me, it's helpful for me to ask another mentor, hey, I got this feedback. Could you speak into this? Would you agree? Maybe it's a blind spot for me. But I loved the overall, okay, I receive it with humility and walking in the way of Jesus and maybe a bit of curiosity.
Yeah, that feels like a good word, curiosity. Yeah. Andy, kind of towards the end of our conversation, you summed up that you felt like it was really important to ask yourself if you are helping your donor to worship.
Yeah.
And I appreciated the way that Travis talked about giving and generosity as a form of worship, which we know it is, but it was good to hear him talk about that. And I loved the connections he made to, if people are going to trust me to lead them in worship, then I want to be trustworthy in leading them towards the worship of giving. I thought those were meaningful connections.
And I think when you sit down to write a piece of communication, whether that's an email or a newsletter or whatever, to have the framework of how am I leading other people closer to Jesus through this, not just telling them about my life.
Yeah.
And giving them the bullet points. I think that's a wonderful filter and a wonderful lens to approach your communication with. And really a gift to them.
Yeah, because they are, like Michelle said, partnering with the Lord.
Yeah.
And it's really what he's up to that you're just part of, and that you're just kind of filling people in to the little part you see, but it's what he's up to.
Yeah, I think on really both sides of it, one being like in giving and supporting someone that's going, there's a practice of trust or a practice of responding to the most extravagant gift of generosity we've ever received in the person of Jesus, and receiving that and then practicing by responding the same way, responding with generosity. And then I think there's also on the person who is support raising side of things, I think there's a lot of pride that can get dismantled when you support raise and lean into humility. And I think when we learn to receive financially from people to support us in going, it like unearths something in us to receive in greater measure the free gift that God has given us. And so it's so weird and radically beautiful.
Yeah, informative, like you said early on. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it just makes me think about just the difference of a child receiving something versus an adult with a fully formed prefrontal cortex. You know, it's like, and just thinking about how we're called to be like little children, and they don't have any problem receiving a gift.
Sure.
You know?
I'll take another, please.
Or just, yeah, they don't have the same obstacles or the same pride, I guess.
They don't let themselves get in the way of the gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even the shame that can come up. Like, oh, this person wants to give me X amount, but we can like perceive, oh, this is going to cause them to be in this financial status. And so I'm carrying shame now on that. Whereas a little child like freely receives.
Yeah.
And thanks the Lord and knows it's all his already.
Yep.
And he wants to give good gifts, and then they walk and move in that.
Yeah. Well, guys, any last thoughts from our episode with Travis?
I'm just so grateful that he was able again to take time out of his schedule. I know he's a busy guy. So to take time to deal with this and to wrestle through it with us, I think that was just a gift.
Yeah. I find myself often saying this about our guests, but I mean it in earnest, that he was just such a delight to host.
Yep.
Genuinely a very kind and authentic. Yeah. Super authentic and just personable and an invitational guy. And so I'm just really, like you said, grateful for his time. And yours as well, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. Very thankful for your time as well, and for the work that you are doing to support and equip the local church and others around the world.
So good.
Yeah.
Thank you. So good to be with you.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.